You're listening to the Place Northwest COP26 podcast series,
a dedicated series that explores all things net zero carbon and sustainability within the built environment.
Alongside some of the biggest names in property, we'll be delving into topics such as
why the market is pushing net zero carbon faster than legislation.
Is renovation and retrofitting better for the planet than new construction?
How can we balance sustainability concerns with profit margins?
And much, much more.
Don't miss any future episodes. Subscribe at placenorthwest.co.uk/subscribe or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Place Northwest COP26 podcast series. I'm your host, Paul Unger. Today's episode is sponsored by SI Sealy. SI Sealy is a specialist building services and decarbonisation design consultancy that delivers detailed MEP designs across all sectors and building types. Utilising the latest technology, SI Sealy has expertise in reducing carbon emissions and achieving regulatory compliance through innovative and sustainable building services design. In this episode, we'll be discussing how the public sector is working towards Greater Manchester's net zero carbon target of 2038 and what the drivers and the challenges are. To discuss this and more, I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Holland, Programme and Policy Lead for Energy at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, by Dmitri Korolenko, Lead Sustainability and Physics Engineer at SI Sealy, and lastly by Matt Pickford, Technical Director at SI Sealy. Welcome to the podcast, everybody.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
So Sarah, if we start with you, can you just set the scene and tell us what we're doing here in Greater Manchester?
Yes, thanks, Paul. So you've mentioned we've got our target to be carbon neutral by 2038, and that is part of what we're trying to achieve. But I think perhaps what's more important as well is the carbon budget that we set up at the same time. So it's not just about coming to the end date of being carbon neutral. It's more about making sure that we are managing, our activities within that carbon budget. So I think as it stands, the budget is 67 megatons of carbon emissions by 2038. We're already nine megatons beyond that target. So if we continue to act as we are doing, then we will have expended our budget within 6 years.
And when you say we're beyond that at the moment, is that in terms of if we carried on as normal, or how does that work? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so we worked with the Tyndall Centre and Thesis to devise a carbon pathway to get us to zero carbon by 2038. And so what that pathway creates is a budget. So each year we have a certain amount of emissions that we don't want to exceed. But we've already exceeded our allocation for the years since that budget was set. So we've exceeded it by 9 megatons of carbon emissions already. So what that's meaning is that we need to do significantly more in the short term to firstly get ourselves back onto that carbon pathway, but then also to make sure that we're staying on that pathway to give us the best chance of achieving our zero carbon target. So we don't want to carry on as if nothing's happened up until 2038 and then suddenly become zero carbon. We actually have to start implementing activity now to reduce our carbon impact.
Absolutely. So I think what you're saying there, Sarah, is that we're a little bit behind the curve of where we need to be to attain these targets, and they are great targets. They are challenging targets, but I think need to be hit. And obviously we've got some catching up to do. But the more time we have to do that catching up, the better. So it's good to be getting the idea into our heads now that there is a climate emergency and there is very definitely something we need.
That's exactly it. Yeah. So we don't want to sit and do nothing. We need to act now. And as I said earlier, if we carry on as we are doing, we will have used up all of our budget in 6 years.
Yep.
So we're significantly, over budget. We need to change our activities now.
Yeah. And when people hear about 2038 and think, oh, that's 17 years off, that actually that's quite alarming to think, well, it's about the amount, it's about the budget, and we'd have exceeded that in 6 years.
That's exactly it, Paul. I think there's a risk that people become too focused on 2038 as a target, and it almost creates a sense of, relax, we've got, years to come. But in fact, we haven't, because alongside that target, there's a budget, and we are not keeping to that budget. And if we don't keep to the budget, there's risk that we will never achieve our target. So I think we need to understand the 2038 target in addition to the carbon budget that we have to work with. And so what that means for the public estate at this point in time is to replace boilers once they're at the end of their useful life with moving on to heat pumps. But we can't just be focused on heat pump technology, because there are many steps that need to be taken to make sure that that is a viable technology, it's fit for purpose. And the evidence has shown that our buildings need to be a certain level of energy efficiency before a heat pump can really work to its optimum.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be a bit of a crossroads in technological terms, where the targets are set. We know where we're moving, but the direction has not sort of been set in stone. Between heat pumps and using some sort of mix of fossil fuels and hydrogen, promoting that particular infrastructure, we do not have a clear sort of path, and I think every council, every sort of industry is taking the goal and running with it in their own direction. And it's very interesting that you mentioned that the time frames are hard to conceptualize. And you mentioned we're passing the target by 9 megatons of carbon, which is a number or figure that is hard to hold in your head as well. Like how big is it actually? What does that mean for my house? What does that mean for this particular building? Or how can I help by getting an electric car? And that's where looking at every individual case really comes into play, and seeing what's out there, and whether the sort of centralized distribution of hydrogen can actually come into play, or whether this will be a more localized solution with heat pumps, and how to integrate it. It really becomes sort of very important.
I think Sarah's role is looking at the overarching policy of energy for Greater Manchester, which obviously someone has to take charge of that and start understanding where funding needs to go and how it gets expended. So obviously at SI Sealy's, we're building services specialists, and what we specialise in is low carbon buildings. So we're if you could say that Sarah's at the macro end, looking at the bigger picture of how this thing holds together and what needs to happen, where we're at the other end of it to a certain extent, looking at individual buildings and how we can take an individual building and let that be a building block into Sarah's targets and policies. So we're currently working with Greater Manchester Combined Authority on 24 fire stations, and we're looking at each individual fire station and seeing how we can take that fire station and make it as close to net zero, if not, beyond that. So obviously we have the challenge of trying to deliver what Sarah wants and the council want in that aspiration, and we face those challenges every day on how we take an individual building and drive down its carbon. Now, as Sarah alluded to when she was talking, there are certain challenges with a certain age of building where they were never designed to be used with air source heat pumps. They were designed to be used with gas-fired boilers and sometimes even steam boilers. So the buildings are very energy thirsty. They need a lot of energy to keep them up to temperature. And that's something that air source heat pumps don't really do. The way they deliver energy isn't really high energy density. It's quite low. They like buildings that naturally want to be warm, that are well insulated. So there is challenges of bringing up the building fabric up to standard where you can use an air source heat pump. And that's obviously a policy that we follow. We approach most of our buildings from a fabric first end, which is well documented. Fabric first. You make the building as insulated as possible and make it naturally want to be as low energy as possible. Then once you've done that, you introduce systems into it that are as energy efficient as possible, using LEDs, good light fittings, air source heat pumps, that type of thing. So any energy you do use is being used incredibly efficiently. And then on top of that, you've got renewables. I personally believe that air source heat pumps span the gap between renewable and efficient because they still do use a primary fuel that has a carbon content in it. But if the national grid goes carbon zero, then it is immediately carbon zero. So I think the fuel of choice for the most part will be electric. But again, with air source heat pumps, you have a couple of technical challenges. Air source heat pumps don't really like generating high temperature hot water. They really start to lose efficiency once you go above 45, 50 degrees C. You can get some air source heat pumps that go above that, but their efficiencies start to drop off. The problem there is the generation of hot water for domestic washing, for sinks, kitchens, things like that. Normally, you would like to generate water above 60 degrees C, and that's absolutely vital in hospitals as part of the HTMs, is that you have hot water above 60 degrees to kill off Legionella. So we've got two contrasting requirements. We've got a requirement to generate very hot domestic hot water, particularly in hospitals, and particularly in kitchen areas where you need to remove grease, and air source heat pumps that inherently are low carbon. And that's probably where hydrogen starts to step in and play its part, is that we can use hydrogen fuel to generate the domestic hot water. So we have air source heat pumps doing the heating, and we have hydrogen doing the domestic hot water. I think Manchester have installed a hydrogen boiler at Gorton Library, I think I was reading on the internet. So it is something that is being looked at, but I do think it's something that needs to play a bigger part in this journey, and in particular places like hospitals, universities, where the infrastructure for hydrogen can be centralized and controlled.
And Dmitri, you've been doing a lot of low carbon surveys as part of your work in this area. What have you been learning as you go along to add to what Matt said there?
Well, the primary challenge is, I guess, the age of the building stock, and as Matt mentioned, it has been designed at a different time when carbon was not an issue, where relatively cheap, and relatively abundant energy source such as gas can just be used to overcome any sort of downsides the building's fabric would have. And obviously now we'd want to design it from the ground up, but that is impossible, as decarbonizing the existing stock obviously makes more financial and even more sense in terms of carbon emissions, because reusing existing structures would have a lower sort of embodied impact. There was a lot of interesting conclusions that we've made looking at fire stations in particular. Hot water demand was one of them. Base load hot water demand is present in every fire station where an emergency serviceman and women basically require a shower once a day. And using generation technologies like heat pumps will not be, or they are not a solution right now. So obviously some sort of complementing technology is required to look at that. But also on one side, the operation of the plant is subcontracted to external sort of contractors. The boilers, when the boilers fail, there is a lengthy procedure to have someone come in, fiddle with the controls, and hopefully get it up and running. The people operating the buildings themselves have no control over how the plant operates. So there have been reports of cold days in summer where nothing can be done to raise the temperature when a seasonal set point has been set. But also reports of overheating spaces where as soon as sort of your seasonal set point in October comes to pass, the heating is full blown on, and some older buildings don't even have TRVs on their radiators, so people cannot control their environment.
And you mentioned subcontractors there. I was going to ask about the supply chain and if anybody has a view on getting the message down through the supply chain and whether we have the skills to deliver on what we want.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we're acutely aware of. We're underway with activity at the moment on our public sector buildings to deliver £78 million worth of interventions that we've secured through the public sector decarbonisation scheme. And that activity, working with Greater Manchester supply chains, has really identified that there's a growing need for a different skill set, because as we're moving towards different heating solutions and basically whole building retrofit, it all needs to be thought about as an integrated package as opposed to kind of standalone systems. So I think partly understanding how fabric works with heat pumps, work with solar generation or other measures, it all needs to be thought about holistically. And I think certainly on the heat pump side of things, a number of design considerations have been brought up in discussion today, and that's exactly what our supply chain now needs to work on. So something that Greater Manchester Combined Authority is thinking about through the retrofit task force that the mayor is chairing is how can we ensure that, one, we are delivering the level of retrofit that we need to, but two, how do we ensure that we are developing robust skills and the supply chains to deliver that? Because quality of systems will be key to ensuring that these systems work as we need them to. Otherwise, we don't want to risk people ending up in fuel poverty. So I think definitely there's a lot of work that's taking place now to make sure that there are training programs that are matching our requirements to deliver these solutions. And there's also a role that's being talked about in terms of a retrofit assessor that is accessible to people that are needing to think about doing retrofit works, but thinking about the system as a whole. There's someone that they can go to help guide them through that process and making sure that they're getting the right contractors to deliver the right solutions.
Sure. And Matt, on the private sector side, what's your view of the skill set, the supply chain capabilities?
Again, it's similar that if there's going to be a wholesale change towards air source heat pumps, then yeah, I think there is a skills shortage, particularly with maintenance engineers and to a certain extent installation. As Sarah alluded to there, I think there's a retrofit standard which is past 2035, and then I think there's a more commercial one which is past 2038, which are all standards that we're looking into obtaining accreditation on to undertake those works and try and maintain a standard. I think a large part of this, as always, such is life, it's going to come down to money. It does come down to money, and there needs to be a point where it is illuminated to everyone that yes, saving a penny or two now might cost you a fortune in the future. Now, there's also a double-edged sword challenge there with changing to air source heat pumps. with the current cost of electric, you may find that an air source heat pump isn't cheaper to run than your gas-fired boiler, which if you're already on the brink of fuel poverty, changing to a badly designed and badly installed air source heat pump will ensure you are in fuel poverty. Recently this year, I changed to an electric car and thought I was being quite smart by installing a charging system at home that followed the price of wholesale electric and calculated what was the cheapest way to charge my car. So I've changed wholesale to this energy tariff that goes up and down with the price of wholesale. Now, this was brilliant a couple of months ago because at some point during the night I was paying 4p a kilowatt hour to charge my car. I'm currently paying 35p a kilowatt hour. And by my very rough calculations, it's more expensive to run my car on electric than it would be to run it on petrol. So there's an awful lot to be learned and an awful lot to understand about how we make the change to greener fuels without pushing more and more people into energy poverty.
Yeah.
That's obviously on the domestic scale. On the commercial scale, it will just come back down to the good old, what's my repayment? How do I get repaid? Is there a return on investment from changing from a new gas-fired boiler to a new air source heat pump? And sometimes you find that the answer is no, there isn't a payback. A lot of the time you do find that there's a payback, but a lot of this comes down to good consideration and good design on the retrofit.
Yeah.
I think by looking at the building holistically and approaching it fabric first. Now, again, this is where it becomes problematic, particularly for developers and things, because they don't look at things that way. They think, how can I flip this building? How can I buy this building, do it up, install some new heating, and then sell it on for a profit? They're not bothered about the energy costs or indeed the running costs 10 years in the future. So it's an interesting challenge of how do we capture that moment when we've got an opportunity to refurbish a building and enable it to be done. And that's sort of, I don't know, that's an interesting moment of how can we get hold of some of these developers and capture that moment when there is a refurb and perhaps inject some cash from funding or something to make it more viable and more likely to take off. Now, whether that's the carrot or stick, that's obviously for some policy to decide whether it's going to be carrot or stick.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, we've seen the volatility of the energy market recently with all the headlines around gas prices, and you touched on the finances there and policy, and maybe Sarah would want to come back in as well. But it'd also be useful to understand about your work at SI Sealy and the different models and financial forecasts and other outlooks that you prepare for people. But I mean, firstly, Sarah, where is the onus for financing retrofitting the public estate? Is it with central government? Is it with different localized authorities or services? How are there mechanisms for working that through?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mix. At the moment, there is a lot of focus from central government to support the public sector with decarbonising its estate. So that's through the public sector decarbonisation scheme. Now, the mechanism is slightly changing in that it was pretty much 100% grant funded, but now the way in which it's moving, it's more that it's seeking match funding. But I don't think we can be reliant just upon grant funding or some form of subsidy. This has to work if we are to achieve the rate of impact that we need to. And so looking at different models is definitely what we need to do. And I think there are a lot of buildings that still haven't had any retrofit done to them. So I think across GM, about 7% of public buildings have been retrofit to a sufficient standard. So there's a lot, maybe 20 or 30% of our buildings are still at a G rating or lower. So there's a lot of interventions, opportunities for interventions out there that can be done very cost effectively. And we should be making sure that we are looking at those and delivering those just under business as usual. I think as we then start to progress at the moment, I think heat pumps are relatively early on in terms of being seen as a retrofit solution. So we're using the government funding to really upskill ourselves and our knowledge around how heat pumps can be retrofit into buildings and what supporting activities need to take place. But I think once we drive that demand, costs will come down, as we've seen with PV and other generation. And once costs come down, it means that there is essentially a business case to then accelerate their deployment. So I think short term, there's grant funding to help close that gap. But a lot of the solutions already exist, and that's where we should be focusing our effort, not on the really difficult ones. But that said, we still also need to be thinking about solutions to kind of overcome the challenges that we do have on some of our estate, the more difficult to retrofit buildings.
For those listening that may be wanting advice, practical steps, they're starting their journey, working with their own assets and partners, what would be your sort of short-term advice in terms of focusing their efforts if we go down the line? Matt, I'll start with you.
A lot of these, you can start with incredibly simple things, just by checking thermostats, making sure a thermostat's working correctly, changing from electromechanical thermostat to a digital thermostat. The differences are immense, and just by reducing, your thermostat by 1 degree can make a massive saving on your energy, and that's just at a personal level. At a more commercial level, again, it really is follow the principle of fabric first. Sort the fabric out, sort the building out, sort the windows out, stop it from leaking, and then replace things with energy efficient systems. And at the moment, I think my biggest bit of advice to people, particularly on the commercial scale, is to not think about the now, but think about 5 years' time, when our government could, for instance, start taxing your energy use based on your EPC, which for me isn't a massive jump in a likely methodology of which to tax people for their energy use. It's exactly what happened on cars. We measured the carbon output of cars, and you now pay tax based on the carbon output of that car. We've measured the energy use of buildings via the EPC methodology. The government now has this data. Will they in 5 years' time turn around and say, we're going to tax you based on your EPC? So I think, it's protect yourself at all times, that old boxing analogy, that try not to look at the now, look what you could be battling with in 5 years' time. And I think that's the approach I tend to give most people now, is think about where you'll be in 5 years' time, because this is coming. Carbon reduction is only going to get a bigger and bigger incentive to everyone. So I'd prepare yourself for it now. It absolutely needs to happen, but yeah, you're going to pay for it one way or the other. So I would say start thinking about it now. Don't put it off. Bring it forward, if anything.
Wise advice. Sarah, anything you would add from your point of view in your area of work?
Yeah, I do agree with both of those points. Firstly, on the data side, having the data and understanding it is key. And then also thinking about planning for the future. Something that we've just implemented for all of our districts is building energy decarbonisation plans. So what this in essence does is take that carbon pathway to 2038 and maps it out for their own portfolios, so they can see what interventions they need to do to each building, or they can play around with that to say, right, if I did X, Y, and Z, how does that look like in terms of my own pathway, and what might the capital cost to deliver those actions look like? What will be the cost benefit? And so I think having that data in terms how the estate is performing, what the biggest emitters are, where do I prioritise my efforts, and then what might the costs be associated with that, because then they've got that data that they can then create a business case and get that approved. And it's long-term thinking that needs to be built into how we do things now, because we don't want to make short-term decisions that then ultimately impact on what might be achievable further down the line. But just to come back on to your point around how do we cover the costs of these things, I think increasingly we need to be looking for private sector to come up with solutions. Just because of the scale of the challenge, we're not going to deliver this all through public funding. And something that we're looking to do at the moment is to look more strategically around public sector owned assets in terms of land, buildings, car parks, and how we can make best use of that. And we're really looking forward to engaging with suppliers of different solutions to see what propositions do come from the market in terms of funded models as well as just delivery models. Because I think that's where we need to start innovating now to achieve the impact that we need to.
Yeah, and Dmitri, would you add on the sort of short-term focus for people? What would be your advice?
I think the sort of main points have been said, but I would mention that we shouldn't forget who these buildings are for. And the most efficient, the most lowest carbon building would have no windows and no doors, which would most probably make everyone working in that building pretty sad. So thermal comfort should not be skimmed in the pursuit of the goal, however noble it may be.
Quite right. No, that's great. Some real food for thought there, some practical advice. Thanks to Sarah Holland of Greater Manchester Combined Authority, Dmitri Korolenko and Matt Pickford at SI Sealy. For more information on them, visit sisealy.co.uk. And see you on the next episode. Thank you.